Hello, everyone. I'm Jonathan Rui, JINSA's Director of Foreign Policy. It's good to see you all again. Welcome to today's webinar, Iran After Raisi. We'll be discussing the significance and potential implications of Sunday's helicopter crash that killed Iranian President Ebrahim Raisi and Foreign Minister Amir Abdullahian, among others. I'm privileged, as always, to be joined today by two Iran experts. Dr. Ray Takei is Hasib J. Sabag Senior Fellow for Middle East Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations, and he is a member of JINSA's longstanding Iran Policy Project. He is the author of many books on Iran, including most recently The Last Shah, America, Iran, and the Fall of the Pahlavi Dynasty. I'd encourage everyone to go to JINSA's website and watch the webinar we did for that book release a couple years back. Gabriel Naronha is a fellow here at JINSA's Gemunder Center for Defense and Strategy. Previously, he served as special advisor for the Iran Action Group at the U.S. State Department. And before that, he was special assistant for the Senate Armed Services Committee, among other things. You can keep up with all of Gabe's latest here on JINSA's website. To our audience, the usual reminder, please type your questions into the Q&A box on the bottom of your Zoom screen, and we'll address them as best we can throughout the upcoming hour. Ray, I'd like to start with you, and we'll start broadly and then sort of drill down to more specifics over the course of the hour. So I realize I'm going to use perhaps an awkward word here, but I'd like you to eulogize President Raisi. What legacy, if any, does he really leave as president, or more broadly in his decades as a regime functionary? How big are his shoes that need to be filled?
Well, those are kind of two different questions, because his legacy as a president was largely inconsequential. And so that you have to put that aside. He was probably the least persuasive and imaginative of all of Iran's presidents going back to 1979. But he was Ali Khamenei's probably favorite president, in a sense that he did what he was told, and he never challenged the leader in any significant way. Ali Khamenei has that problem with all his previous presidents in one way or the other, for different reasons and different ways. His larger legacy was that he has spent his entire career in the security services and the judicial apparatus and the dark rooms of the Islamic Republic as an enforcer of its cruelty, and as was an instrument of his cruelty, his executions of many people, not just in 1988 with the political prisoners that people talk about, but throughout his tenure, he had spent time in judiciary. He was also a member of the special clergy committee that they had for policing the clergy, so he was involved in prosecution of clerics who were in some way not abiding by the official decree of the state. So in that sense, his legacy is a rather grisly one before his ascent to the presidency, and an inconsequential one as president. Now, he was there for 3 years, but I would say a largely inconsequential president, although quite an important figure within the apparatus of coercion that the Islamic Republic has honed over the past 45 years.
So thank you for that. And I'd like to sort of take a different twist on perhaps a similar question. Obviously the president is not the ultimate arbiter of power in Tehran. I think everyone in our audience sort of understands that, but does it, in terms of looking for who might be Raisi's successor, we can, aside from playing the guess who that might be game, how consequential is the president in this system, sort of regardless of who it may be next? So I want to put that in the context of the larger regime decision-making process.
Well, presidents do matter in that system. They manage the bureaucracy, they control the administrative state. They can take initiative that the leadership may not necessarily want, if they choose to be forward-leaning. So the presidents do matter in that sense. Who could replace Raisi? That's hard to say, because it's a succession crisis that the Islamic Republic did not anticipate. And you have 50 days now to come up with some list of candidates that would be subject to elections, and then all the politicking that goes on with that. But I think the profile that the system will look for would be somewhat similar to Raisi in a sense of someone lacking imagination, ability to take initiative, and be essentially more of an implementer of decisions made as opposed to questioning them. That is something I think the regime will look for. Who that may be, of course, is open to question.
And so I want to come back to this larger issue of what this means next, not even just for the president, but more broadly for succession of to the supreme leadership after Khamenei passes. But Gabe, I'd like to go to you now and sort of ask a parallel set of questions because the foreign minister was also killed in this crash, and I think similar set of questions. Does the now deceased foreign minister leave much of a legacy, and if so, what is that? And then as the follow-on, his acting successor at least also has a long history of indirect negotiations with the U.S. So we'd just love to get your initial thoughts on the meaning of all that.
Sure. So Hossein Amir Abdullahian was a little bit in the sense of Raisi, a believer in the unitary executive branch, in the Iranian sense of trying to execute on the supreme leader's direction, not trying to be sort of this different pole of power and taking the regime in a different direction. He was a complete different from his predecessor, Javad Zarif, who was trying to court the West or tried to improve the Islamic Republic's image in Europe and America. His English was terrible. He rarely ever spoke it. He never did. He did Western media, I think, once or twice, where he was asked about the Holocaust and gave a fairly predictable answer about questioning it. But what he was good at was sort of this hard-nosed advancing of Iran's interests in its region, of solidifying ties with Russia and China, and again, taking the regime in a different path, more focused on securing its near abroad, not trying to have excuse me, not trying to have an accommodation with the West. In his absence, his deputy, Ali Bakari Khani, is been appointed as the acting foreign minister. He has been the main interlocutor with the United States. He was the negotiator for these attempts to get back into the JCPOA. And he sort of represents what I would call the best of Iranian foreign policy negotiators, in the sense that he is skillfully manipulated American negotiators. In one very telling admission, he was recorded saying how he was recorded bragging, really, how he had gotten the United States to ignore its own deadline 11 times. And he bragged that each of these times he ignored the deadline with no consequence, and it showed the strength of the Islamic Republic and its negotiating prowess. This is someone who, unfortunately, is very skilled at manipulating the West, is a regime insider, is not trying to reach accommodation. And so it's this, what we're seeing along these lines is more of the same, I think, with Bagheri Khani. And again, a complete departure from the Zarif era in the foreign ministry there.
Thank you, Gabe. I want to sort of some of the things you raised, the Russia and China issues, and also the nuclear talks are things I want to sort of drill down in the back half of the hour. But before we get there, sort of a follow-up question for you, and then I'll see if Ray has anything he wants to add. I've heard plenty of voices and seen plenty of ink about how the deceased foreign minister was an advocate for, I guess, what's been called strategic patience. And was sort of, seen as traveling around the Middle East to get Iran's proxies to avoid getting into an escalatory spiral with Israel or the United States in recent months. So I'm sort of posing that leading question just to see what your response is to that characterization. And if you agree with that, then, if you see that sort of being the foreign ministry's voice going forward. Ray, I'll turn to you. I think Gabe might have frozen.
I think since October 7th, the Islamic Republic had a tough balancing act. Its essential strategy was to inflame Israel's frontiers and even beyond Israel frontiers in terms of interfering with commercial navigation in the Gulf, in order to increase international pressure and American pressure for Israel to impose some kind of restraints on Israelis. That strategy hadn't worked and hasn't worked today. It may work in the future. It has worked to some extent in the sense that the international community does seem to be mobilized. You see it with all these international tribunals. We see it in European public opinion. You see it on American college campuses, and you're seeing it in the changing and evolving nature of Biden administration's approach to the war in Gaza. It hasn't worked in the sense that the Israelis have rejected those pressures, at least seemingly. But at the same time, you don't want things to get out of hand and that Iranian territory itself to be in some way molested by outside forces, simply because the regime appreciates that its hold on power is rather tenuous, and its population rejects its imperialistic interventions abroad. And so the war cannot come home. It has to stay abroad. But the longer it becomes inflamed, then there's a greater likelihood that things can get out of hand. Now, something happened in early April in terms of Iranian attack on Israel that hadn't happened in 45 years, in a sense that the Iranians tried to directly attack, not through proxies and not through anything like that, but through their own 300 projectiles attacking Israel itself. That, to me, reflects something that certainly requires greater degree of assessment and analysis, because in some way it means the decision-making apparatus has changed. It's moving away from the cautious parameters of proxies and deniability and so forth to taking direct ownership of an attack. And if those strikes had succeeded, then we would have been in a very different position. I don't think you launched 300 missiles on a country hoping to fail. So there is an element of recklessness that's now you're beginning to see, which kind of contradicts the previous attempt to impose some kind of a restraint and deal within certain parameters. That may mean the decision-making within the national security apparatus has changed, or something, or the assessment of Israeli power has changed, the assessment of U.S.-Israeli relations has changed. That's something that's one can speculate on, but it requires a greater degree of analysis. Because whenever something has happened that hasn't happened before, that means the rules of the game may be changing in a way that is unpredictable and unforeseen.
Thank you. And Gabe, I want to go back to you. Yeah, technical difficulties, but yeah, sort of repose the question to you. I'm not sure how much of it you caught, which is with the death of Foreign Minister Amir Abdullahian, is it fair to say that he was a practitioner of strategic patience around the region, trying to rein in some of the potential for escalation via Iran's proxies, and sort of as Ray says, are we now sort of potentially looking at a new decision-making calculus for the Iranian regime?
Well, thanks and apologies. My internet's a little in and out here for some reason. When we look at the Iranian foreign policy for the last really decade, really, it's been based on this idea that if you wait out the expirations of the JCPOA, you gain leverage over time. If you slowly but surely undermine your rivals and your neighbors, you gain all this leverage. As opposed to ISIS, which was more of a bit of a flash to the pan, the Islamic Republic has had so much success in doing the slow but steady strangulation of its rivals and the increase of its power. We've been seeing this particularly in its nuclear program, where it's slow but steady accumulation of nuclear material. Again, going very slowly, so not to sort of cause a rapid reaction from Europe in particular, but also the Biden administration. And then narrowly tailoring it back when you go too far, then pushing again and expanding again. One thing that's going to be very important as we see a new president and new foreign minister is that they are going to go and review all the security policy. They're going to go review the strategic calculations that are under their own control. And so you could see some changes here. In the last few months in particular, we've been seeing the Iranian nuclear doctrine be discussed openly in public. And we've seen a lot of chinks in that previously you had the Supreme Leader's what we call the fake fatwa against nuclear weapons. It's never been written. We've never seen it, and it doesn't. We shouldn't take it very credible. But even that in public, they have now said, well, there's reasons to reconsider this. There's exceptions to this. If our security is threatened, all bets are off. And so this is sort of an opportunity where you might see, as we get new leaders, in a restatement or a trashing of those prohibitions, again as a measure to increase leverage and sort of figure out that new plane of escalation that they can take without, again, quite crossing that threshold of testing a nuclear weapon or announcing that they've had a nuclear breakout. And again, this is really important where at the outset of this new administration that we're going to see, setting the guardrails from US policymakers and ideally European policymakers firmly and carefully and saying, as the new set of leadership comes in, here are the guardrails for what we can consider legitimate and illegitimate action, and here are the consequences of their various policy paths.
Thank you, Gabe. That's some great issues you raise, and I will want to devote more time to delve more deeply into the nuclear issue and some of those other things regarding U.S. and European posture toward what's coming next. But before we get to that, I'd like to turn back to Ray and sort of tee it up. Ray, I know you've written a lot and thought about a lot about the succession of Supreme Leader Khamenei. He's aging and is reported to be unwell. And I know you have said that in the past, if I don't misquote you, that Raisi was often considered the favorite for that job next when Khamenei goes. I don't want to mischaracterize it, but with him gone, what is, to the extent it's foreseeable, how do you see Khamenei's succession playing out next? Is it, are they going to swap out one hardliner for another? Am I grossly oversimplifying things?
Well, I think as I have thought this through, and this is one of the black boxes of the Islamic Republic, one of the many black boxes, is I'm not quite sure, given his performance as president, Raisi was up to the job of a leader. That job requires skill, intelligence, and cruelty. He had 1 out of 3. Even in a dumbed down Islamic Republic that grades on a curve, that would be hard. And certainly if he was ascended to that position, that means the position would be of less importance, and it cannot be less importance given the marginalization of other institutions. But Raisi was going to be part of the process of essentially choosing the next leader. I mean, one of the rumors has that within the Assembly of Experts, there was a 3-man committee. He was part of it that was going to choose the leader. This doesn't mean that he wasn't going to end up as being the leader. Quite often in Islamic Republic and many sectors of life, somebody gets the job because he's a consensus candidate, not the better choice. When people cannot agree on something, they say, well, how about him? So they have to go back and figure out what that leadership post will look like and who is the likely candidate for it and where they're going to look for and that sort of thing. It'll be within the conservative clerical community. So at the very least, the process of choosing the supreme leader has to be reconsidered because one of his important actors is no longer there. I tend to have always been skeptical that Khamenei's son can be put in that position. That doesn't mean he won't be an influential person in the Republic. But the Islamic Republic traditionally doesn't do dynastic successions. That doesn't necessarily mean the system isn't filled with Nepo babies. Barkari that Gabe talked about, he's a Nepo baby. Mm-hmm. He's part of the clerical aristocracy. His uncle was a very substantial member of the clerical community, one of the original revolutionaries. I had a chance to meet Barkari once, and he has all the smugness and arrogance of a Nepo baby. But the formal rising of the son to take over the father's position, that's what Arab presidents do. We don't do that sort of a thing. That's what they do. So that doesn't necessarily mean he will not be an important mover and shaker in the back rooms of Iranian politics, but they have to come up with somebody. Now, I'll be very, Islamic Republic has dispensed with charismatic authority and a theological erudition as a qualification for that job. So it now has to be a keen political sense and administrative experience. So those will be the correct, and also being suitably nuts. Uh, so those will be the factors. Is this person bonkers enough? Does he have some administrative capacity? And also the decision making this time, unlike 1989, is going to have more people sitting around the table. The security services will have a say in this. The Revolutionary Guards will have a say in this. So it'll be that kind of a person that will emerge from the dark recesses of the Iranian clerical estate, or at least a segment of that clerical estate that is still acceptable.
So
If I can jump in there, I
please,
think
yeah.
one really interesting question is, what would happen if a cleric was not elected as the supreme leader? If it was someone from the IRGC camp, the security camp, who managed to get that top job. Again, it's a vote of the Assembly of Experts, which is an 88-person institution now, that tends to be strongly favored uh, from your clerical establishment. But especially in the last few years, we've seen the power of the clerics, their popularity in the country fade with all these protests. They're extremely unpopular. But the nationalist forces really remain quite strong, quite ascendant. This would be an opportunity for the Islamic Republic to evolve, not moderate, but certainly evolve in a different direction. Which is, again, we'll see. It's, as Ray says, it's a black box. These are closed room things that aren't reported very well. We get little machination reports here and there, but it's hard to evaluate them sometimes.
Yeah, then so the recent comments by both of you just now, sort of anticipated my follow-on question, which is the average observer of the Middle East right now hears plenty about the IRGC Quds Force and its actions around the region, but I want to sort of address this potentially this elephant in the room, which is the role of the IRGC in regime decision making, sort of more fundamentally or more generally. Is it fair to say that in recent years the regime has become more influenced by Ray, as you said, the IRGC and the security services? Will they play more of a role foreseeably in the succession when Khamenei exits the stage?
Well, the role of security services has been growing, and also you have the phenomena of veterans, people who have been in the system and now are members of the parliament, and so on and so forth. So you have a sort of a people who have gone through. They're not members of the uniformed services as such, but they're former members. So you have a lot of that also percolating throughout the system. The Islamic Republic, from my perspective, is an ideological construct. It requires the legitimization of its founding ideology, at least to those narrow segment of the public that still believes it. I don't think it can transform itself to just another Middle Eastern dictatorship like the Assads or the Mubaraks. It has to have at least some fig leaf of ideological cover. And I think all these people, whether the security services, whether the clerical community or the reactionary segment of the clerical community, which is the dominant segment of it, believe a lot of the same things. They believe in Vilayat al-Faqih, they believe in the government that serves them. In some cases, they may be even believing that they're sanctioned by God to do what they're doing. So there is a sort of a commonality of perspective on those issues. This is one of the reasons why this is such a reckless regime is because it's a profoundly an ideological one. But that ideological creed is also restraining, right? So to answer your question, yes, the security services will be particularly important as the regime goes through transition, and all transitions are volatile, particularly in a state that has forfeited electoral legitimacy and has embarked on a foreign policy whose costs are more obvious than their benefits, and whose public is aggrieved and has demonstrated that discontent by taking to the streets time and time and again. So in that kind of a environment where the regime is afraid of its public, the security services won't matter.
Mhm.
because they're the ones who essentially are keeping the government in power. They're the last source of his power, but not necessarily the last source of his legitimacy from the perspective of those who still believe in the Islamic Republic.
So that's a great prompt for a follow-on question. But before I go there, Gabe, is there anything you wanted to add on this rather weighty question of the role of the security services in the regime?
Look, I think the one piece that we may not think about is whether or not there's going to be mass protests upon the death of the supreme leader. And then again, what role does the IRGC play in suppressing those protests? How does that affect their popularity, the political exigency of individuals involved here? That's sort of a wild card, and there's going to be a lot more wild cards coming here. It reminds me a little bit of there's Kremlinology back in the Cold War of trying to guess who's up and who's down, and sometimes we spend too much time thinking about these things, and it's a fun game to play. But what's always important to remember is the nature and the imperatives of the regime itself. I think when we think about president and foreign minister, they end up being a lot less influential. But the supreme leader job truly is important and in setting strategic direction.
So before we go on to our next question, I just want to remind our audience, if you have any questions for our panelists, please type them into the Q&A box on the bottom of your screen, and we'll address those in turn. Before we move on to some of the policy nitty-gritty and the sort of the U.S. approach to all this, I want to just sort of circle back a little bit more and say, you know, a couple of years ago, a year ago, it seemed like we were hearing plenty about protests inside Iran, especially in the wake of Mahsa Amini's death, and the current administration sort of struggling to find a voice, maybe a charitable understatement, in support of those protests. So Gabe, I'll start with you. You worked in the State Department under the previous administration. How would you characterize the current administration's response, I guess, through the mouthpiece of the State Department, in reaction to the president and foreign minister's deaths in Iran, and sort of, you know, does that offer you a stand-in for the larger U.S. approach toward the Iranian regime at this point, not just in terms of the protests inside Iran, but perhaps more broadly?
So on Sunday, when the helicopter crash happened itself, we saw almost near silence from both Israel and the United States. Sometimes that is wise. You know, often the U.S. having been on the other side of this, U.S. officials are refreshing Twitter just like the rest of us, trying to figure out what's going on. And the imperative sometimes is do no harm. That was taken a little bit too far, I think, yesterday, when the administration offered its official condolences on the passing of Raisi and Amir Abdullahian. Again, there's an instinct of don't antagonize, but this seemed to go almost back to the era of trying to empower the moderates and improve the United States standing among the regime, which is an ill-fated and discredited theory. I would have liked to see a proper tribute to Raisi's thousands and thousands of victims. Again, there are thousands, tens of thousands of families whose loved ones were either killed directly by Raisi's actions or through the system he represented. I've seen almost no recognition from world leaders on any of those. We've seen a few members of the House of Representatives and Senate reflect those victims, but it's been entirely absent. You know, even going back to President Bill Clinton on the passing of Pol Pot, he issued a scathing statement on his passing and talking solely about his victims. And the condolences he passed were really to the victims' families who didn't have the chance to bring him to justice themselves. That, I think, is a fitting tribute to someone of this malignancy.
Mm-hmm. Well put. Ray, is there anything you want to add on this particular issue before we move on?
I would say just observing the administration's approach in a detached and distant way, it seemed to me it is an approach that particularly is tailored toward the general election in the United States. It is an approach that says we don't want any problems with Iran between now and November. Now, the last thing we want is a mushroom cloud in Isfahan in October. So therefore, you continually pass messages to them saying that we're not seeking a wider conflict and we're not seeking this, we're not seeking that. You don't enforce the sanctions. This is essentially a short-term approach that is that's a design with the domestic political calculations. That's not even a criticism. It's an observation. There may be something to that. If you're running for re-election, you say, okay, we don't want more dogs barking. I am, in general, offended by the concept of proximity talks, where a U.S. representative sits in one room in Oman, an Iranian representative sits in another part of the hotel room, and Omanis walk back and forth passing messages. The reason why the Iranians are doing that is first and foremost to humiliate the United States. There is one thing about the new generation of Iranian leaders that are coming to power, because every mature system, and 45 years is a mature system, one of the things they like to do, the new generation, is to deliberately be offensive in their interaction with Westerners, particularly with the United States. So there is no point to proximity talks. You just sit with someone in a hotel room in Oman or elsewhere and pass on messages back and forth directly, have a conversation. So one of the things I would have advised any administration is to say to the Iranians and those whom presume to speak on their behalf, from Oman to Mass Avenue, that no, we're not going to do proximity talks. If you got something to say, meet us in Geneva. And we're not going to do secret diplomacy. We're just going to announce it. We're going to show up. You show up. You show up. And that's what we do. Barring that, there's no other way we can communicate directly and purposefully. So that's what I would say about the overall approach that I think this administration is taking. It's willing to be humiliated, but it's willing to essentially hope that the one thing that they fear that Iranians do, namely detonate before November, for that to be forestalled. Mm-hmm. And for that to be forestalled, you have to concede on all the other stuff. Now, if you're looking at it from a domestic political perspective, that may not seem unreasonable, but that's how I see it.
So that's prompted a follow-on question I have for you, Ray, which is, is it likely is it a fair assessment to say the Iranians, will play along with this game? I know you've talked about in the past how, and certainly Gabe has as well, about how Iran's nuclear program is more or less at the point now where, if they wanted to, they, detonating a bomb in Isfahan a week before the election wouldn't be necessarily out of the range of their capabilities. Is Iran from their own perspective, in a good position now with their nuclear program, where they can keep making these token concessions and just sort of playing along?
Well, the question that's often asked, it's a threshold question, is why haven't they detonated? Why haven't they done it? And honestly, it's a basic question to which there is no reliable answer. There are no particular technological barriers that they cannot resolve, or perhaps with the Russian Federation's assistance, if such assistance is indeed forthcoming. I don't know if it is. Is why haven't they done it? It seems to me, and this is mere speculation, they haven't done it because they fear the possibility of American or Israeli strike at the time of domestic volatility. And we're in a period of domestic volatility right now with, the new leadership coming to power and so forth. But what I just said is their perception of latent American and Israeli power. Those are dynamic variables. Mm-hmm. They can go down. So the greater degree of space between Israel and the United States will invite more recklessness. And you saw that in early April. To some extent, I think the decision to launch an attack against Israel was predicated on the assumption that the differences between Israel and the United States are as such that the United States would work hard to disable an Israeli response. By the way, that was true. That was not an incorrect assessment. So I think right now with all the election summer stuff, they'd be preoccupied by that. But honestly, I don't know why they haven't detonated. But if my assessment is correct, there's no reason it would be, is that the problems between U.S.-Israeli alliance and Israel's preoccupation within the Gaza Strip and Israel's larger position within the international community, which today is a contested one, will help smooth the path toward atomic empowerment.
So I want to go to Gabe next, but stick on this theme. Before I do, just a shameless Jinsa plug. If you go to our website and just search the word daylight, you'll find plenty of material on this point that Ray was getting to, which is the correlation between the amount of strategic daylight between the U.S. and Israel and sort of Iran's appetite for recklessness and aggression in the region. But Gabe, I want to come back to you on the nuclear issue. We've got an upcoming IAEA quarterly board meeting at a time when the head of the IAEA is doing what seems like a routine, regular trip back to Tehran to supposedly extract some concessions from the Iranians to be more transparent with their nuclear program. You know, if Ray's assessment is certainly correct, which is the U.S. just wants to kick cans further and further down the road. I mean, how much longer can they really keep doing this? Because this, you know, if past is prologue, this quarterly board meeting will be perhaps another missed opportunity to censure Iran and you know, perhaps do something exert more pressure through international sanctions. But I just love your thoughts on that on the eve of this next board meeting.
Yeah, so some reports we're seeing now at the Wall Street Journal are that for the past year, really, the United States has been blocking censure resolutions at the IAEA's Board of Governors meeting. It's gotten to the point now where the Europeans are getting quite frustrated at American appeasement, really, of Iran, and they're complaining publicly and to me privately as well, that saying what the U.S. keeps blocking this. So it's not a very good sign when the French are a little bit stronger than us on this front. The whole point of this being the United States does not want to, quote, provoke Iran into escalating on a number of things. The issue here, of course, being that each time the United States accedes to some implicit or explicit Iranian threat, we are paving the way for Iran's nuclear extortion to both succeed, as well as to teach their system a lesson, a very valuable lesson, that they can in fact deter United States action across a whole number of sectors through threats. So typically the Iranian regime will say, if you censure us, or if you try to snap back UN sanctions, then we will withdraw from the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, or then we will kick out IAEA inspectors. And so this is one of the threats they've been using, is trying to hold IAEA cooperation hostage to appeasement of them at the Board of Governors meeting. Now, I think one good news for us is we're unlikely to see a nuclear test or major actions on that front while there's this presidential transition happening. But Ray's exactly right. We keep kicking the can down the road just a little bit. When I've talked to Biden administration officials, what they usually say is, hey, look, trying to stop a nuclear threshold test or a nuclear development is the top priority. The problem has been that they have sacrificed so much of other priorities at the altar of nuclear policy that it's in fact emboldened them. And then really it's ceded leverage to the Islamic Republic on these fronts. So it's a little disappointing to see that even though the Biden administration's sort of grand strategy for Iran for the past 3.5 years was stop Iranian nuclear progress, the results of that strategy have been slim to none.
So thank you for that, Gabe. And I'm sort of sticking with this larger issue of escalation and daylight. You know, Ray, you talked about how the U.S. basically did everything we could on April 13th and 14th to give Israel a reason not to retaliate and potentially escalate. But, you know, the reason Iran launched such an unprecedented strike, or the thing it was responding to, was this series of Israeli strikes that have really done some damage to the IRGC Quds Force in the region. And then Israel's, you know, rather understated response later that week in mid-April, sort of a scene setter. You know, do you think the Iranian regime has is it possible to know if they've sort of agreed to an implicit or tacit sort of de-escalation with Israel for now, for lack of a better reason? Is it, and more specifically, if Israel goes into Rafah full bore and it looks like Hamas's last bastions are about to fall, where does Iran see Hezbollah's threat to escalate with Israel in that context? Now, it's a lot of questions packed in, but
Well, and the answer to it is bound to be a speculative one, given our lack of visibility into the Iranian system, and as Gabe said, we're relying on a lot of press and commentary and so forth, and trying to decipher the treaty. So I can only offer you my own speculation. I don't think it is my just opinion, and I want to contextualize that the Israelis going into Rafah, which I do think they need to, and the sort of a pacification of the Gaza enclave. I don't think that invites Iranian and Hezbollah retaliation. I think the absence of it may actually embolden them. But I want to contextualize that by saying there are things happening today in the region and even beyond the region where we are too often surprised by the initiative of our adversaries. We are too often explaining their behavior the day after, as opposed to trying to predict it the day before. Now, I think that was probably true of Russian invasion of Ukraine. It was true of Hamas's attack on Israel on October 7th, and it was true on April Iranian attack against Israel, which, as I said, it was profoundly unpredictable. The consequences could have been catastrophic. So our enemies are behaving in a reckless manner that we had not anticipated before. Their usual routine question to your answer, Jonathan, is that no, Hezbollah would not be activated because in a manner that invites its destruction, because the Iranians like to husband that particular proxy force for further attacks and pressure on Israel and the United States and other regional detractors of theirs. That is the usual answer. Nothing that has happened in the Middle East since October 7th is the usual thing. So my usual answer to you is what I gave, within the context that this particular analysis could be completely wrong. We're in uncharted waters, and I'm not sure if I fully understand those waters today. So maybe I'm the wrong person to have here.
Well, there's certainly no harm in being wildly speculative in some of the arenas like this, but no, I think your caveats and your acknowledging uncertainties is very important way to view what's going on in the region, especially since October 7th, and the sort of the increasing pace at which things seem to have a capacity for escalation around the region.
Right.
I think those caveats are both important, including in a strategic sense for understanding what's going on in the region. And so with that in mind, Gabe, feel free to insert as many caveats as you like into this next question, because it will be another rather far-reaching one. Ray mentioned Russia, and obviously you testified last month before the House on a lot of issues related to Iran's relationship with Russia, including Raisi's visit to Moscow earlier this year, proclaiming something like a broad friendship and increasingly close strategic ties. Could you give I don't think this issue is really fully appreciated. Could you give our audience a little bit of sense of Iran's deepening ties with Russia and what it means and what the U.S. is or isn't doing to address them?
Sure, and actually, this does play a little bit into the transition world, where the current acting president, Mohammed Mokhbar, or I think I got that name right, was leading one of the delegations to Russia in 2022 to negotiate arms deals between Russia and Iran. And that is currently the principal relationship between Iran and Russia is on the arms sector. When you look at the Russian economy and the Iranian economy, they share a lot of characteristics. They're characterized by heavy intensity in natural resources, particularly oil and gas, and extractive industries. And they now both suffer from U.S. sanctions. And so Russia, in its early days of the war, actually sought consultations with Iran, and Iran sent delegations of sanctions busting experts to try to give them best practices advice. And so the irony there is that Russia is now competing with Iran on the market of sanctioned oil. Both Russian and Iranian oil is under certain restrictions by the international community. They both rely on ghost fleet tankers to transport the oil, but they now compete with each other on that market of sort of clandestine or illicit oil. So they actually hurt their own economic fortunes a bit. But what we've seen is Russia and Iran conclude agreements. Iran is sending thousands of suicide drones to Russia. They've been building a factory about 500 miles east of Moscow to be able to build 6,000 drones per year of these suicide drones. And in return, Russia is sending Iran advanced aircraft, attack helicopters, and trainer aircraft. Part of the environment for this and some Iranian accusations have been that U.S. sanctions have decimated the Iranian airline industry, and Foreign Minister Zarif, who is their chief and still their best propagandist by far, alleged early in the incident that the U.S. aviation sanctions were responsible for the crash, which I wish were true. I'd love to be able to take credit for that. Unfortunately, it appears it's incompetent pilots being the main error there. But still, again, Iran lacks modern aviation, modern helicopters. And so Russia's been able to supply a lot of those things that they have a little bit of excess for. They don't quite need in the war, while they need Iran's cheap and expendable munitions for that. One thing we've always seen Russia do is they've played Iran's protector for the last 10 plus years at the United Nations, blocking unfriendly resolutions, vetoing things, giving top cover at the IAEA. It's worth noting that wasn't the case from 2006 to 2011. Russia agreed to a lot of these sanctions on Iran, and their feeling was broadly that Iran was irresponsible. They were childish almost in certain respects, and they didn't believe that they were responsible enough to have a nuclear weapon. And so they agreed to a lot of these pressures, even though it kind of hurt their bilateral relationship and their broader strategic efforts. That's gone now. That era is long gone. This is now a unified coalition against the West, which they're happy to use to just provoke the United States.
So Gabe, those UN sanctions you mentioned from 06 to 11, those are UN Security Council sanctions that required Iran to basically stop enrichment. I mean, we're in the grand scheme of things, when we think of sanctions, we're actually pretty robust on Iran's nuclear program. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, these were the arms embargoes against Iran's conventional weapons imports and exports. Their exports of ballistic missiles, drones, anything that could be used as a nuclear delivery system, and then sanctions on its nuclear program itself, on everything from uranium centrifuges, research development, cooperation there. Those all got lumped into one resolution in 2015 in resolution 2231. Now, most of them have expired. The last vestige of that UN resolution expires in 15 months, when that resolution will expire entirely. And unless Biden and Europe act before then, there will be zero international sanctions on Iran.
So thank you. Very, very, very well explained. And I just have one final, a rather speculative question for you on this issue, which is, we've heard a lot about, Iran potentially getting advanced Russian combat aircraft, air defenses, radars, things, that would certainly help the defenses for its nuclear program. And we've also heard, conversely, of, potentially Iran sending ballistic missiles to Russia for use in Ukraine. Do you have any speculative or not insights on if and when those actual things might happen?
So the Europeans have very much said that this is sort of a red line. They've indicated there'd be severe penalties if Iran did indeed transfer these ballistic missiles. That being said, we've had some reports from Reuters that Iran did indeed transfer them back in February. But what we haven't seen is Russia actually use them on the battlefield. And so one of the speculations is that Russia has them in reserves in a break glass in case of emergency stockpile. Understanding that the consequence for using them will involve likely the restriction of Iran Air and other Iranian airlines from European airspace and potentially other penalties as well. So very interesting to see that specific tailored threats from the Europe and the United States can actually cause Iran to back down at times.
So with the little time we have left, I want to try to loop in a couple of questions from our audience. And this one is probably the most straightforward question they'll be asked today. I guess, Ray, I'll start with you. What more could be done, broadly speaking, to support dissident efforts in Iran against the regime?
Well, very briefly, we have to do everything we can to weaken the regime. Because by weakening the regime, it's like physics. You for every action, there's a reaction. By weakening the regime, you will obviously empower the forces of opposition. And there are a variety of ways we can do that. Sanctions has been mentioned as one of them. More forceful advocacy, there could programmatic stuff you can do. But the bottom line is two things I will say: weakening the regime, and I would add one more thing to it. I think there is and this may be actually a bipartisan consensus, is most policymakers or aspiring policymakers in Washington really, at the end of the day, don't believe that the Islamic Republic will collapse. They understand its vulnerabilities. They appreciate its estrangement from its public, but they believe that somehow it will kind of muddle through. And that perception itself, which I think in some ways is a bipartisan one, debilitates our ability to think creatively about this issue.
Thank you. Gabe, same question to you, given the import and sort of the upshot of what we've been discussing for the last 50 minutes.
Well, piggybacking on Ray's point right there, I think there's, especially with this administration, a defeatist mentality of the Islamic Republic is too strong, we can't do something. If you look at and this applies to a lot of our dictatorships around the world, if you look at the past year, we have seen Russia survive a coup against Putin. We've seen the Chinese economy stall and youth unemployment soar so high they stopped publishing the figures. And now we've seen this, an embarrassing moment where the regime for 16 hours could not locate their foreign minister and president. Yes, they are strong in the sense that they can deploy goons to the street to kill their people, but they are weak in the sense of domestic legitimacy, in the sense that they are fragile and incompetent governments in many respects. And so if you have that vision, you can do something. I think the thing that I fear about, and that Ray may call me out as a defeatist on, is I do worry deeply about who would replace this government should it fall. I worry deeply that the IRGC and the security services would simply impose a nationalist, brutal government, and that we would not see the liberal forces prevail. To me, that is a great opportunity for the US government to say, what is our plan to ensure that such a government could succeed? It shouldn't just be saying, oh no, this is bad. It's what steps can we take to empower the liberal, democratic, secular forces in this country or outside the country to prevail there. Rhetoric is the very first step. There's a lot of other clandestine and fun things that you can do behind the scenes, which I hope to see in the next few years.
Well, I like to end these webinars as much as possible on relatively optimistic notes, so I'm gonna count that one. Thank you, Gabe. Thank you both to Ray and Gabe for their time today. And as always, stay tuned for further JINSA content related to these issues, including webinars. Thank you again. Look forward to seeing you on another one soon.
Thanks, guys. Thank you.
Thank you.